copy and shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle. See to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. Now, that's a really interesting statement because we think, what's important about that, the significance, the parallel of heaven and earth. Is there a parallel there between what earthly worship was in the tabernacle and what heavenly worship will be in heaven? Is there a parallel? Because we don't really worship today in an Old Testament pattern, right? We don't really do that. I mean, maybe in our heart, in our mind we do, but we don't have a lot of what Old Testament worship consisted of. Sacrifice, right? We don't have that. Sabbath, we don't have that. Old Testament worship was really about going to the temple to worship. That's really what Old Testament worship was all about. Matter of fact, in Deuteronomy it says, if you can't make it to the temple, then take your offering and use it to buy whatever you want and be merry, basically be merry and worship there, But the idea of Old Testament worship, when you get towards Jesus, Jewish worship, essentially, it kind of shifted because we had synagogue worship in the days of Jesus. We see that synagogue. Paul was in a synagogue. Jesus was in a synagogue. Synagogue was not part of what Moses brought down off the mountain. What Moses brought down off the mountain was the tabernacle, the pattern for the tent and the tabernacle that was set up in the wilderness. There was no such thing as synagogue or worship outside of the temple in the law. The only reason the synagogue ever came into existence was because when the Babylonians came and destroyed the temple and carried off the Jews could no longer sacrifice because you have to sacrifice in the temple, right? So they couldn't sacrifice. Jews weren't told, sacrifice in your house or sacrifice. We talk about patriarchs like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and we see their sacrifices, right? Wherever they were. Take the boy, go up on the mountain, sacrifice. But when Moses brings down the law, worship became about the temple. Everything was about the temple. You go to the temple, you do your sacrifice, and by the time of Jesus, you see a shift in that because of synagogue, but yet the Jews still went to the temple. Day of Pentecost, when Peter preached his sermon, it was so built up because everybody was there for the Pentecost. Everybody was there for that feast. Feast of Booths, all these different feast days, Passover, when Jesus was crucified. They were all in Jerusalem because you had to go to the temple to worship. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that God said, you got to come here to worship? Why do you think God did that? Why did he just say, just worship wherever you feel like it? You go outside your house, make a sacrifice, go find you a Levi. There were a lot of Levi's, right? Go find you a Levi of the tribe of Levi and make your sacrifice at your house. No sense going to the temple. Just stay home. Do your sacrifice there. Worship there. No sense going anywhere. Why do you think God said you got to go to the temple to worship? You ever really ask yourself that question? Why did he do that? I think it's part of that. It's important. Something that in other words, it was something you had to set aside to do. You couldn't just do it, right? You couldn't just wake up in the morning. So I decided I'm going to go worship God out in the front yard this morning. Build me a little altar, make me a little sacrifice. God will be happy with that. As we look at the Old Testament, when people did that, God was the opposite of happy with that. God was unhappy with that. Matter of fact, if you look at a lot of what happened when Israel and Judah split, a lot of what really got Israel in trouble and Judah in trouble was altars on the high places. You remember that? So they built altars on the high places. What does it mean when they did? What does that mean when he says that? He says you discuss God because you build altars on the high places. Well, do you know what does that mean? What were they doing? What do you do on an altar? Right? What do you do on an altar in the Old Testament? Altars were for sacrifice. He says, you're building altars up on top of these mountains. It doesn't say that they're altars to foreign gods, if you really look at it. I mean, some of them I'm sure are. But it doesn't really say that. It just says you're building altars in the high places. You're taking worship upon yourself, in other words. You're not doing what I said to do. And because of that, I'm really upset with you. Matter of fact, I'm more than upset. I'm going to let the Assyrians come and wipe you out and carry you off because I'm done with you. That's pretty serious, right? When God says that, that's pretty serious. Because what happened was, when Israel and Judah split, Jerusalem, the temple, was in Judah. When that kingdom split under Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and you had the northern tribes of Israel and the southern tribes of Judah, all of Israel, they no longer were going to Jerusalem to worship. Because guess what? They weren't the same kingdom anymore. And so when Jesus meets a woman at the well, in John, the Gospel of John, when Jesus meets a woman at the well, he says, what does she say to him? She says, our fathers, we ought to worship in this mountain, but you say we ought to worship in Jerusalem. Remember that? What does Jesus say? I don't have to look it up. What does Jesus say? Jesus says there's coming a day, right? He says, we worship what we know, and you worship what you do not know. That's what Jesus says. He says there's coming a day when true worshipers will worship God in spirit and truth. So Jesus is saying that worship you're doing on evil, that doesn't mean anything. You see? In other words, you need to be in Jerusalem. So there was a reason God did that. God could have made it a lot easier on everybody. Israel, Judah, it's quite a ways when you're on foot. I mean, it's a pretty good walk, right? I mean, Judah's not really, really big geographically, but, 40, 50 miles on foot with your family. That's a pretty good trek. That's like walking from here to Tulsa. They were at least doing that, a lot of them. Some of them were coming from further than that. Can you imagine saying, well, we got to go worship. Let's take off. We got to walk to Tulsa to go worship. Right? So you gather up your family and you take off walking. How long does it take to walk to Tulsa? With a family. I don't think you can't do that in a day. Could you do that in a day? You couldn't do that in a day, could you? So there's robbers on the road, there's thieves on the road. You got to have money because guess what? When you get to the temple, what do you got to do? Buy your sacrifice. Unless you're going to carry him with you, carry him along. Well, I don't think I want to myself. If I got to walk to Tulsa, I don't think I want to lead a lamb to Tulsa when I'm walking. That just seems like that'd be a lot more work to me. Right? And not only that, Roman money is no good in the temple. So it'd be like saying your U.S. dollars, the temple in Tulsa doesn't take U.S. dollars. You got to have drachma. So when I get to Tulsa, I got to go buy my sacrifice, right? Which is crooked. Isn't that what Jesus says? You're all robbers, right? And then I got to go to a money changing table, and I got to change my dollars into drachma because that's the only thing you can use in the temple. You got to use temple money. Because Roman money, what did Roman money? Jesus said, whose image is on this coin? Whose image was on that coin? Can you take a graven image into the temple? What's a face on a coin? Right? It's a graven image. That's against the law. You can't do that. You can't take that into the temple. It's a graven image. Right? So you can't even take that in there. So all of a sudden, you're walking to Tulsa with your family. You're going to be there for a week because this is Passover week. You're going to be there for a week. So you're going to get your family. You're going to walk to Tulsa, stay there for a week, and walk home. You're going to miss 10, 12 days of work. Right? And you're going to spend all that money. That seems pretty burdensome to me. Doesn't it to you? I mean, I think that's pretty burdensome. See what Jesus said, I'm going to set you free? We don't understand. We don't understand what that means, really. But the point I'm trying to make is God made worship really burdensome. Right? And he says, you got to go to the temple, and you got to do it a certain way. And all this has got to happen in a certain way. And he tells Moses, he says, make sure you make this exactly like I told you, because what this looks like down here is what it's going to look like up there. So, what does it look like? What did the tabernacle look like? What was the significance? Let's think for a minute. I think it's important. We never really think about this, but it's really important. So let's think for a minute. What is at the temple in Judaism? Now get your Christian mindset out of the way, okay? In Judaism, what is at the temple that's not anywhere else? The big thing. Huh? The Holy of Holies. What's in the Holy of Holies? God's presence. Right? So when they're going to worship, they're going, in Jewish thought, to where God is, because God's rest in temples. Remember, I showed that. You missed it, Sam. I'll have to show it for you again. God's rest in temples. Isn't that what? Remember that? God's rest in temples. So when you have a temple, that's where God rests. That's where God is. So that's one thing. You got to go where God is to worship. That's part of it. I think the other thing is that God says, when you come to worship, I don't want you doing anything else. Think about it with me for a minute. You ever tried to worship it at your house? You ever done that? Really worship with your family at your house? It's really hard, isn't it? It's almost awkward, actually, because for one thing, you're just not as comfortable with it, and you're like, well, what do I do? Do I do it just like I do it at church or whatever? It gets a little uncomfortable because you're thinking, and what if it's because the setting is your house and you're not used to worshiping in your house? But the other thing I think that really affects you in your house is that when you're home is where we go to relax and to take it easy, and we have other things on our mind when we're at home. I do. Don't you guys? You know, when I'm at home and I'm just sitting, I got other things in my mind. I need to be up doing this, I need to be doing that, right? I ought to clean these dishes up or clear this table, or maybe I'll take the trash out or whatever. All those things are on our mind, right? So God said, when you go to worship me at the temple, because you're having to go to the temple to worship, that should be all that's on your mind. There's nothing else there to distract you. There's no other, your life isn't there to say, oh, take care of my life, and then, okay, God, I'll give you. No, you're there for one reason. You're there to worship. Right? So God said, listen, go to worship. Go worship. You know, even in the case of Abraham, and that's the very first time in the Bible the word worship is used. Shakah in the Hebrew. Very first time in the Bible the word worship is used is when God told Abraham, and Abraham says, stay here to his people that come with him. He says, stay here while me and the lad go to worship. That's the very first time in the Bible we have the word worship. So even though Cain and Abel sacrificed, right? Even though Noah was righteous before God, even though Enoch never tasted death to God, all these righteous patriarchs, the first time in the Bible we see the word worship is when when Abraham says, me and the lad will go up here to worship, but he's going to sacrifice Isaac on the altar. That's the very first time the word worship is used. Isn't it interesting that God didn't tell Abraham just to sacrifice Isaac where he was? Have you ever thought about that? God says, go to the mountain and sacrifice your son. You see, worship with God is sometimes more than a mindset. It's a place. It's the idea of moving yourself to a place where you're not distracted by other things of the world. Why do you say go to the top? You ever been to the top of a mountain? You ever been to the top of a mountain? Everybody in here has been to the top of a mountain? We always want to get to the top of the mountain, don't we? Why do you want to get to the top of the mountain? See the view? But it's quiet, isn't it? And you're above the world, and it's quiet, right? It's majestic, and it's wonderful. I'm from Colorado. I love being on top of mountains. And when you're on top, very top of the mountain, I always want to get to the very top. Susie's like, we're almost, this is close enough, we can see from here. I'm like, no, you got to go right to the top, very top. Because when you get to the top, it's where it's quiet, it's peaceful, it's majestic. You just want to sit up there and just sit on top of the mountain and just take it all in. God says, take him to the top of the mountain, take him up on the mountain, and sacrifice your only son. So when you see what he's saying here, he says, make this just like I tell you to make it, because the reason I'm telling you that is because it's a copy and shadow of what? Of what is in heaven. Right? Remember last Wednesday night, I showed you that thing about where God rests. Remember that? God rested in the tabernacle to a Jew in the Holy of Holies. It's a shadow of what's coming. So where's God? Where will God rest? In heaven. That's his tabernacle. That's his temple, you see. And when we go to there, we enter his rest, you see. That's where he is. So when we talk about the shadow, so there's several things in the temple, in the Old Testament temple. There's several things. And one of those things is the outer court, where everybody is. Then there's an inner court, a holy place, where the showbread is and other things, a sacrificial table, the showbread, the table of incense, are in this holy, which is in this inner court. And then there's the Holy of Holies, which is where, in the tabernacle, and the tent, where the Ark of the Covenant was, and that's where God was. So he says that is a shadow of what heaven will be like. But God will be there, just like God was in this tabernacle that you built, so will God be in heaven. Because as he rested in this temple, so he will rest in this temple. This is where you will be. This is where you'll be in the presence of God. But if you contemplate New Testament worship, how we worship, and our view of worship as compared to worship throughout the entire Bible, then we begin to wonder, what does God expect in our worship? Susie said, we were in Texas this weekend, you all know that, and she's like, and I'm like, well, we got to find a church, so she found a church. And of course, when you're trying to travel and get home and it's late, and you're like, well, this is going to put me later, later than whatever, late. And anyway, we went to church, and a little church down in Texas, and we got out. Susie says, why couldn't we just worship in here? Why don't we just listen in here? Why do you have a problem with that? And I said, I just have a huge problem with that. I said, I just think that if we're on vacation and we need to take time to worship. I said, I just feel that way. I said, if I don't, I just feel like I've done something wrong. I said, that might not be your view. I'm not telling you what you got to do. I'm just saying, to me, if I get home at 2 in the morning because I start to worship, then so be it. I'm all right with that. And that's what I told her. I said, if I got to drive till 2 or 3 in the morning to get home, if that's what it takes for me to go worship on Sunday morning, that's what I'm going to do. I don't care. And so, because I feel like, myself, to be together, to worship, is what God intends for us to do. I think he intends for us, just like in the Old Testament, to go somewhere to worship. I think that's what God intends for us to do. I think he intends for us to be purposed, to go, to be together, to fellowship. To me, that is integral to our worship. I don't think you can worship. And I know people watch us online, and I'm glad you can do that. And I know people do it that can't be here, and I understand that. And I'm not saying that it's sinful to do that. I'm just saying that I don't think online worship is what God intended for you and me to do. If there's any way we can be together, and I know there's times we can't, don't get me wrong, I understand that. But if there's any way for us to be together, I think we need to be together. And I think that's backed up in the worship of the Old Testament. God wanted his people to come and to be together, didn't he? He wanted them to come and to be together in one place. He wanted to be purposeful. They had to decide to do it, and he wanted them to be focused because of where they were and who they were with on one thing, and that was God. And I don't think that's changed. I think it's still the same today as it was 5,000 years ago. I think God expects the same thing from us. So, and I think when you look at this copy, that's what happens. It's a new covenant, and that's what he's saying here. And it's established on better promises, because the promise of the law, the promise of Moses was not heaven, was never heaven. Moses never promised them heaven, ever. There was nothing in the law about going to heaven. The only thing Moses promised them was the land beyond the Jordan. Okay? That was it. That was the promise. Our promise is better, because Jesus promises us heaven. And just as they crossed their Jordan to get to the promised land, you and I cross our Jordan, death, to get to the promised land. But our promised land isn't their promised land. Our promised land is heaven with God. And so that's our promise. There was something wrong with the first covenant. What was wrong with the first covenant? What was the primary thing that was wrong with the first covenant? It was imperfect sacrifice. Unattainable. Couldn't do it. But the biggest thing that was wrong with it was the wrong promise. I mean, Paul said, if you have hope in Jesus in this life only, you're of all men most miserable. Right? The promise of the old covenant was land. God's presence in the land. God's protection in the land. It was a territory, but it wasn't heaven. And so because of that, you couldn't get, and this is what the Hebrew writer is getting to. That law can never get you to heaven. I don't care how good you are, how much you keep it. It won't get you there. God found fault. I'll make a new covenant. Not be like the covenant when I took them by the hand, because they did not remain faithful, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. I turned away. Right? In other words, he divorced them. Okay? He turned away from them because they played the harlot. He says, I'm going to put my laws, this is out of Jeremiah, I'm going to put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I'll be their God and they'll be my people. And no longer will they teach their neighbors to say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, for I will forgive their wickedness, will remember their sins no more. This covenant is about forgiving and remembering no more. The old law, as the Hebrew writer is fixing to bring up to us, was just the sacrifice is only a reminder of sin. Could never take it away. It was just a reminder. Now there's some argument about that, and we'll get into that a lot deeper when we get into that part of this. But the main thing he's trying to tell us in Hebrews 8 is that this new covenant has made the old one obsolete. There's not two covenants. There's only one. And that it's old. The old covenant has been outdated, and it will disappear. So he's writing this to Jews. The temple's still in Jerusalem. The sacrifice is still going on when Hebrews was written. Sacrifice is still going on in the temple when the book of Hebrews is written. And he's writing this to them Jews to say that sacrifice that's being made in your city, being made in the temple, that sacrifice is no longer of any effect. Doesn't matter. Because that sacrifice is imperfect, and this temple that you have is only a shadow of what's in heaven, and you need to look for the real thing, not the shadow of what's in heaven. Isn't it interesting that God destroyed the temple? Didn't he? Isn't that what Jesus said in Matthew? He says, I tell you, not one stone will be left upon another. Right? Why did God do that? Why did he just let it survive? Why isn't there still a temple? Why did God destroy it? You ever thought about that? God could have saved the temple if he would have wanted to. Judaism could still be in Jerusalem. Jerusalem could have been Israel all along, couldn't it? I mean, if God would have willed it. But now where the temple stood, what stands where the temple stands in Jerusalem now? Dome of the Rock, big mosque, right? Huge mosque. Big gold top mosque. If you ever look at pictures of Jerusalem and see that big gold top mosque, that's the Temple Mount. That's where the temple, the Jewish temple, used to stand in Jerusalem, Mount Moriah. God destroyed it because God's not there anymore. Right? It doesn't mean anything. It's not his home. Remember, I said God rests in temples? God's not resting there anymore. It's not his temple. It's not his tabernacle. He's not there. He doesn't care. You and I kind of care maybe because we think, oh, why is that Muslim mosque on the Temple Mount? I'm sure Jews care, right? But God says, don't live there anymore. Don't care. Don't care what's there. Doesn't matter. Because God said I turned away from him. You see? Are there any comments? I'm talking too much. Coffee's getting cold. Y'all ain't talking enough. So there was regulations, and there was an earthly sanctuary. In the first room were the lampstand, the table with consecrated bread. That's the holy place. And that's where all the priests worked all the time. They did sacrifices. Behind the second curtain was the most holy place, what we call the Holy of Holies, which had a golden altar of incense and a gold-covered Ark of the Covenant. This ark contained the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that budded, the stone tablets of the covenant. Above the ark were the cherubim of the glory overshadowing the atonement cover. We cannot discuss these things in detail to describe the ark. The ark's no longer in existence, or we don't know where it is at the time of this writing, at the time of Jesus, the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant went missing when the Babylonians took over Judah. So either the Babylonians took it and destroyed it. Jeremiah says that, and that's in an apocryphal book, not a book you'll find in the Old Testament, your Old Testament, but an apocryphal book. It says Jeremiah took the ark and hid it in a cave in the Temple Mount where no one will ever find it. So according to the apocryphal book, it's under the Temple Mount. It's under the Dome of the Rock somewhere in a cave. Nobody will ever find it. Of course, y'all probably heard me tell this story before. My favorite story is the ninja monks in Africa that are guarding the temple. And you need to Google that because I just think it's fascinating. The ninja killer monks that have the Ark of the Covenant, but you can't see it because the ninja killer monks will kill you if you try to get into the Ark of the Covenant. You need to Google that. I think it's a great story. Anyway, so it's one of those three places, okay? But the monks in Africa say they have it, but they're not showing it. So because I guess they would have to kill you if they showed it to you. I don't know. But anyway, Google that. Great story. Ninja monks, African ninja monks. Anyway, the ark's not there anymore at the time of this writing. The priests entered into the outer room all the time. The high priest entered the inner room only once a year, which he had to sprinkle himself with blood. Y'all probably know that story. For the sins of people who committed in ignorance. Big statement there. Blood would never cover deliberate sin, ever. And the blood of the sacrifice of the Old Testament would never cover deliberate sin. Deliberate sin was unforgivable under the law. So there was no coming back to God. Deliberate sin was unforgivable under the law. So there was no way back. You see how it was imperfect, right? It says the Holy Spirit was showing by this that the most holy place had not been disclosed as long as the first tabernacle was still functioning. It's an illustration for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifice being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. They were only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations. Look at 9. It says they were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. What do you think that means? We're not able to clear the conscience. Are our consciences cleared under Jesus Christ, do you think? Hard question. Should be, shouldn't they? Right? But because we understand the sacrifice of Christ and the atonement of Christ, and that should clear our conscience. We shouldn't be going back to God again and again saying. But the point the Hebrew writer is going to make is under the law, that's what they did. Every year was a reminder of the sin, reminder of the sin, reminder of the sin. The conscience was never cleared, in other words. You never had a clear conscience towards God. And that's his argument. That's what he's building up to, and that's why he says that. It couldn't clear the conscience of the worshiper. But when Christ came, and once again now he's already established him as high priest under the order of Melchizedek, When he came as a high priest of the good things that now already here, he went through the greater, more perfect tabernacle, not made with human hands, not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ash of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are what? They are outwardly clean. In other words, it never cleanses you inside. Your conscience is never cleared. It makes you ceremonially clean, outward clean, but not inward clean. And God's worried about our heart, about our soul, not our outside. What do you think Peter says in 1 Peter 3:21 when he talks about that? And he says, the same baptism, right? The same baptism also now save you, not the cleaning of the filth of the flesh, Peter says, but the answer of a what? A good conscience towards God. In other words, it's not the outward cleaning of the Judaism. It's not the bathing of Judaism. It's not just cleaning the outside, because that's what Jews did. They were familiar with that. That's what they did. When you went into the temple, you had to do that. Male men that went into the temple, you had to go through a mikveh. You had to bathe. There were two mikvahs. There was one that was a bath. You had to bathe, and then you had to go through the mikveh, which is we would call a baptistry. You had to go through the mikveh to go into the temple because you had to be clean. When a woman was on her time of the month, right, which was kind of an interesting concept in the Old Testament if you've ever studied it, right? Matter of fact, she had to leave the house, go into the old tent where all the women was on their time of the month. It was my sister. I love my sister, had the greatest analogy. She said, that had to have been a wonderful time. And I'm like, you're weird. And she says, no, really. She says, because most women, their time of the month is always the same, pretty much the same time of the month. So she goes, you probably had this group of women that you really got to be friends with, and you didn't have to cook, you didn't have to take care of me, you didn't have to clean, you didn't have to do any of that. You just went and hung out in this tent with all these girlfriends that you knew, and it would be like your week vacation. I don't know about that, but that was my sister's take on it. And so anyway, and then after, and even in Orthodox Judaism's day, under the law, after a woman came off of that menstruation cycle, came off her time, what did she have to do before she could go back home? She had to bathe, right? And in Orthodox Judaism today, women who are coming off their time before they will go back into their husband, they go through the mikveh before they will go back into their husband. Because under Orthodox Judaism, a woman on her cycle was unclean. Remember that? Matter of fact, you couldn't sit where she had sat, right, in the law. If she sat somewhere, you couldn't sit there. It was unclean. So this idea of ceremonial cleansing to a Jew was a real thing. They did it all the time. When John the Baptist showed up in the wilderness and said, oh, guess what? I'm going to baptize you. And when I was a kid, it just floored me because I'm like, why all of a sudden, there's no baptism in the Old Testament. And these people are just showing up to John and he's dunking them in the river. And why would they do that? Doesn't make any sense to me. When I was a kid, it just blew my mind. I didn't understand it. I said, why would they do that? Why would you go to this out in the wilderness so somebody could dunk you in the river? You know? I mean, why? Because I've looked all over the Old Testament. The word baptism doesn't exist in the Old Testament, right? And I'm like, why do they do that? And then when I started getting old enough and I started studying it, I came to realize, well, the word baptism is a bad word and it's just immersion. And the Jews, as far as being immersed in the river, in water, that was not anything new at all to a Jew. That was nothing new to a Jew. They did it all the time. It's no big thing. Now, of course, in Judaism, it has to be living water, right? This won't count. If you're a Jew, this won't count, okay? Because Judaism, to be a mikveh, and there's a mikveh in Oklahoma City. To be a mikveh, it has to be living water. And that either means it has to be a stream or it has to have rainwater. So mikvahs in big cities like Oklahoma City, they collect rainwater and put it into the mikveh. That makes it living water. Doesn't Jesus talk about living water? Right? You ever thought of what that meant? Streams of living water? Living water. This is dead water, I guess, in Judaism. chlorinated, dead. So it was important to them. So when John the Baptist wants to baptize them, immerse them, where does he go? Jordan River, right? Living water. Doesn't go to the pond, right? Takes them to the Jordan. Baptize them in living water. Baptism immerses them in living water. They're used to that. They do it all the time in the temple. No big thing. As a kid, I could not understand, could not comprehend that. Nobody could explain that to me when I was a kid. But I think it's fascinating. So washing, ceremonially, washing, I always say wash. I tell you from Oklahoma. Sydney always laughs. She gives me such a hard time with that. Sometimes when I'm preaching, I say wash on purpose just so I can see her eyes roll back in her head. I can almost hear them. Washing. So ceremonial washing is no big thing to a Jew. And he says, so all these things can't do it. But he says this blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offers himself unblemished to God, cleanse our conscience from the acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. Cleanse our conscience from the acts that lead to death. So Christ's blood, so what cleanses us, right? Water? Does the water cleanse us? No, not at all. But what does Paul say in Romans? He says, don't you know that as many of you are baptized into his what? Death, right? So where do you hit the blood? Where do you hit the blood when you die? You see? Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because you got to hit the blood, right? People have all kinds of arguments about baptism. People say, oh, you're just a water regenerationalist, you know. I don't know if everybody's ever told you that or not. You don't hear that thrown around much anymore, but old-time people used to throw that up. You're just a water regenerationalist. You just think it's all about baptism. No. I think it's about obedient faith. But the blood of Christ is what saves us. It's what cleanses us. I don't think anybody can argue that point. The question you have to inevitably ask yourself is, where do you hit the blood? Right? Where do you touch the blood? Well, you touch the blood in death. Right? I mean, makes sense, don't it? Touch the blood in death. So, what he's trying to say here is that this blood of Jesus is perfect. And because it's perfect, it cleanses us perfectly. The blood of a bull and a goat could never do that because it's not perfect, you see. When the priest would go into the temple, the Holy of Holies, Aaron was the high priest. He would go into the Holy of Holies. Or any high priest went in the Holy of Holies. They had to sacrifice a lamb. They had to take that lamb's blood and they had to sprinkle it. They had to clean themselves first. They had to be clean, washed, clean. And they had to, I'm working on it. And English is my first language. And when they did that, and they were all clean, and all these white garments, and they were all clean and spotless, they had to take that blood and they had to sprinkle it all over themselves. And then they had to sprinkle it all over when they went inside. Because being clean on the outside didn't make them clean on the inside. They had to have the blood. You see, baptism, water can't save you. Cannot save you ever. Right? But obedience and touching the blood of Jesus can save you. So, anyway, out of time. Thanks for your time this evening.